Hello again. To conclude the first question of Chapter 22, The Clash of Cultures, we'll continue talking about the airplane, and it comes into its own in the 1920s. It was invented in 1903 successfully by the Wright brothers, who were bicycle shop guys, and they liked tinkering with planes at Kitty Hawk, and the first flight only went a few hundred feet. And this industry develops very slowly until the First World War, when the Europeans adapted it as a military weapon, and Americans didn't even have any planes. They had to fly European planes when the pilots went over there when we finally got involved in 1917. And Lindbergh and Amelia Earhart will be a huge boost to the new aviation industry. In 1927, the 26-year-old Charles A. Lindbergh Jr. made the first solo transatlantic flight. He traveled from New York City to Paris in 33 and a half hours. The heroic feat, which won him 25 grand and the CMH. It was a truly dramatic accomplishment, ladies and gentlemen. He stayed awake this entire time. There's a great James Stewart movie that shows the spirit of St. Louis. That is the title of the film. He flew through storms, blinding fog, and when he finally landed in France, more than 100,000 people greeted him. And when he got back to New York City, the parade was even bigger than the end of the Great War. And youngsters developed a new dance step in his honor called the Lindy Hop. And this guy, Lindbergh, was a cultural hero. 5 years after his flight, New York City celebrated another pioneering aviator, Amelia Earhart, who became the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic. And there's a nice picture of her, and she tragically disappeared out here somewhere in the Marianas Islands or Micronesia. Legend has it that she was a prisoner in the Japanese jail here on Saipan, and there have been individuals here investigating whether or not this was actually true. Nobody knows for sure what happened to the aviatrix. No study of the 1920s, ladies and gentlemen, will be complete without discussing car culture, made possible by Mr. Ford. And this is the most significant economic and social development of the early 20th century, the widespread ownership of automobiles. And Mr. Ford brings this about. He vowed to democratize the automobile. Brilliant statement. When I'm through, he predicted, everybody will be able to afford one, and about everyone will have one. And he certainly did that by paying his workers twice the average industrial wage. He paid his workers $5 an hour, which will have repercussions later in the late 30s and early 40s, ladies and gentlemen, because he did not see the need for unions then. And Ford will resist unionization of his factories bitterly, given what he was paying when his industry started. It cost about 22 grand when the Model T first came out. And by 1924, because of efficient assembly line production techniques, he was able to reduce the price of the car to about $4,000. Where's that going on today? Maybe cell phone production, maybe, but nothing on this scale. The car didn't change too much as opposed to how cell phones do. And it came in one color. Ford ads assured buyers, ladies and gentlemen, you could have it in any color you want as long as it was black. And there's about 1 million cars in 1916. By the beginning of the 20s, there's 8 million. And by 1929, there are more than 23 million, the overwhelming majority of which are Fords. And Henry Ford made a bundle. And lo and behold, how about that? They discovered a lot of oil in Texas, Oklahoma, Wyoming, and California. And by 1920, the United States is producing 2/3 of the world's oil and gasoline. And also around this time, right after the First World War, during the First World War, they will also discover oil in Southwest Asia, namely Saudi Arabia. And later, Iran will have vast deposits in Iraq For the workers, though, working in these automobile plants is a monotonous, mind-numbing experience, especially since Henry Ford prohibited them from talking, sitting, smoking, or singing on the job. But his methods worked. The U.S. built 10 times. His techniques were copied by everybody, ladies and gentlemen, and they produced 10 times more automobiles than did all of Europe. This changes social life. Make no mistake about it. During the 20s, Americans literally developed a love affair with cars. In the words of one young man, young people viewed the car as an incredible engine of escape from parental control. A safe place to... And we've already talked about this phenomena, the repercussions in all these other industries. It sparked a real estate boom in Florida, which will go bust by the end of the 20s, just as it did early in the 21st century. And all the roads leading to Florida will have all kinds of gas stations, traffic lights, billboards, and motels. Also another place for escape. And they are constructing more and more paved highways, but this really takes off, ladies and gentlemen, with the Interstate Highway Act, as we'll see in the 1950s under the Eisenhower administration. Here's a picture of Highland Park outside of Detroit. Again, the worker is stationary. The product moves to him, where each worker completes a task, and then it goes on to the next worker, and so on. And this greatly sped up the production of cars. They're no longer handmade, but they are mass produced. But this tends to be a very dull job after a while. Spectator sports went hand in hand with the rise of consumer and mass culture. And no one symbolized this more than the Big Bambino, as we'll see. They had a way to get to the stadiums now. A lot of people have cars. They have leisure time. By the 20s, most people had Sunday off, and they might even have a half day off on Saturday. They drive into the countryside to visit relatives or friends, and they'll go into the city, which is where the baseball diamonds and stadiums were, to see boxing, college football, and baseball. Those are three huge sports that are part of spectator sports, along with thoroughbred horse racing, the four big sports of pre-World War II. And again, these are the big sports. The Bambino, the Sultan of the SWAT, traded by the Red Sox to New York in 1919 and creating the curse of the Bambino. The Red Sox won't win the World Series again after winning it with Ruth 3 different times in the 1910s. Harry Frazee was broke, so he needed money because he was really more involved on Broadway in producing plays, and a couple of his plays went bust and he needed cash, so he sold Ruth to Colonel Rupert and the Yankees, who were a non-entity before he arrived. And by 1923, Yankee Stadium, the house that Ruth built, will be constructed because so many people go to Yankees games. So many people listen to the Yankees on radio. He smashes home run records to the point where he's no longer a pitcher as he was mostly with the Red Sox. He's now an outfielder playing every day, because this man can hit home runs, and he changes baseball from the dead ball era of the bunt and the hit and run and the steal into, let's hit the big ball, let's get a man or two on base, and let's hit the 3-run homer and win the game. Power becomes part of baseball as opposed to the former dead ball tactics favored by Ty Cobb and others earlier in the 20th century. Ruth is an American folk legend. 68 jars in 1927, 713 for his career. Roger Maris will break that with 61 in 1961, and Hank Aaron will break that with 714 in 1974. Also, baseball is a segregated game, so there is no African Americans playing during the Ruth era at the Major League Baseball level. That's definitely a significant thing. The black Babe Ruth was a man by the name of Josh Gibson. Football, especially at the college level, attracted huge crowds. Pro football is a non-entity until really the post-World War II era it begins to grow. And the biggest college athlete of the 20s in college football was Red Grange, the phenomenal running back, the first athlete to appear on the cover of Time magazine. In a 1924 game against Michigan, the bruising, galloping Ghost scored a touchdown on each of the first 4 times he carried the ball. After all, there are 2 shapes now moving, 2 ghosts that drift and glide. And which of them to tackle each rival must decide. They shift with spectral swiftness across the sworded range, and one of them's a shadow, and one of them is Grange, written by the most famous sports writer of the pre-World War II era, Mr. Grantland Rice. What a football player. He is melody and symphony, as the students carried him for 2 miles across campus. And there's the Time magazine cover that he was on. Another huge star of the 20s, the Manasseh Mauler. Jack Dempsey was especially popular with working class men, for he too had been born poor and lived for years as a hobo, wandering the rails. Ruth was an orphan, ladies and gentlemen. And he challenged toughs in bars, and he won a lot of fights, and that's how he made his name in the boxing racket. He fought for money, and eventually he defeated the huge Jess Willard, a 300-pound guy. Dempsey might have been 190, and he lays that guy out, and Willard threw in the towel after the 4th round. Finally, he's defeated by Tunney in 27 with the long count. It's on YouTube. Tunney had more than 10 seconds to get up from the blow that Dempsey gave to him. There's 105,000 people at that fight, with all of these 10 state governors, numerous Hollywood celebrities. Some 60 million people listened to the fight on radio. Dempsey was more than a champion. He was a hero. Jack Dempsey's restaurant in New York City was there into the 1960s. A leading sports writer stressed that he was warm and generous, a free spender who, when he had it, and a soft touch for anybody down on his luck. And so ends question 1 on the factors that led to the rise of consumer and mass culture.